Let's understand the world a little better. I'm your host, Simon Wunderlich, and with me is Manfred B. Steger for a second time. He's a sociology professor at the University of Hawaii at Manoa and author of, I think, actually more than 30 books on globalization. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
The latest one being Globalization in the 21st Century was just released in January 2024. And today I would like to talk obviously about globalization and the up and downsides and how it started and where it will lead to. And with that, I would like to start with two quotes by two prime ministers, actually. One that is by Julia Gillard, who was Prime Minister of Australia, and she had a quote about globalization. My guiding principle is that prosperity can be shared. We can create wealth together. The global economy is not a zero sum game. So it seems like a positive outlook on globalization. Whereas Nelson Mandela, Prime Minister, not current Prime Minister, obviously, but Prime Minister of South Africa, said, where globalization means, as it so often does, that the rich and powerful now have new means to further enrich and empower themselves at the cost of the poorer and weaker, we have a responsibility to protest in the name of universal freedom. Now, I've read plenty of these quotes in preparation, and there were a lot of quotes by leaders who had a positive outlook on globalization, a lot of leaders who had a negative outlook on globalization. I was wondering, what do you think? Is it a net positive or net negative, and how did you come to your conclusion?
Well, first of all, Timon, thanks for having me on your program again. I'm very delighted to be here and be talking to your listeners again. So thanks for that. Thanks also for these two quotes, because I think what these two quotes have in common, even though they seem to be saying the opposite, is they all take globalization to be something about economics. They both talk about wealth. They both talk about economic expansion and whether or not this is good for people. But what they have in common is they consider globalization to be something having to do with trade, tradable commodities, economic activities, economic processes. And if you take globalization to be just that, then you're really in trouble. Because it seems that globalization in the public discourse is just about economics, but globalization is about much more than that. So, for example, you can think of globalization as the expansion and intensification of information, of ideas, of symbols, of songs, of culture, of fashion. So that's, of course, connected to economics, but not necessarily just about economics. It's about meaning. And it's about how people understand meanings and what people like or dislike, how they want to spend their free time, what they want to engage in. So it's something that really has to do with cultural exchange. You can also say that another side of globalization is about institutions and the expansion and the intensification of connections among institutions. Now, of course, there can be transnational corporations, that would be economics, but let's think of other institutions like Manchester United fan club, with like 600 chapters around the world in all countries, people from all national backgrounds sort of rooting together for Manchester United. And that, in a way, is sort of an institution that has globalized these fan clubs, just as an example. And that can't just be boiled down to money. Of course, money is connected to it, but it's not just about trade. It's, again, about something that people feel they're engaged in that's not just necessarily an economic activity. And finally, think of globalization as moving bodies, bodies of people, bodies of animals, bodies of viruses. It's not necessarily just about economics. Sure, people sometimes move because they want to better themselves economically, but sometimes people move because they're just curious. They're taking a year off after college and they want to see the world. Or other kinds of people are moving because they want to see relatives that live in other places. Has very little to do with money. It has to do with the ability to move. Mobility, in other words, is part of globalization, and increased mobility. And that doesn't always translate into economics. So what I would ask our listeners to consider is that globalization is multidimensional. It has several domains. And economics is just one domain. And if we conflate all of globalization just with economics, then we're really missing out on these other very important dimensions. So to answer your question, do I think is globalization is positive or is negative, as you pointed out in your quotes? It depends on which dimension of globalization you consider. And even within those dimensions, you can go further. So economics, for example, it can be about transnational corporations. It can be about trade. It can be about economic refugees or economic migrants. It can be about a lot of different things. So what we need to do, especially as informed citizens, is we need to really be very, very careful to specify what it is that we're talking about when we talk about globalization.
So maybe to understand it better or to better get a grasp of it, we can break it down, make it as simple as possible. Um, as a naive, know nothing person, when think about globalization is, or it starts with connectedness between two different regions or countries. That's where the basic globalization starts, and that
Right.
obviously on a global scale.
Great point. Great point. I'm glad you broke it down. We can really talk about it as intensifying interconnectedness, but interconnectedness has many faces, right? It has an economic face. If you think about tradable commodities, for example, so global supply chains that broke down after COVID, right? It has that face, but it also has interconnectivity in terms of ideas, interconnectivity in terms of people, interconnectivity in terms of institutions. So interconnectivity cannot be just confined to economic interconnectivity. That's one thing that most people talk about and mean when they say globalization. But what they're actually missing is a whole bunch of other things that sort of submerged under the surface, right? Like an iceberg. The obvious thing is the thing that looks out, that's above the surface, but there's a huge part that's underneath that's just as important.
Mm. But I would assume that it probably is also how it started, right? With trade routes between different countries, and then
Yeah.
obviously also cultures, ideas shifted as well. But originally, probably with trade, right?
Well, I think originally you can say that trade certainly is a big part of it. So, in other words, the economic component is a big part of it. But think of, for example, why, just as an example, right? One of the dates of globalization, if you think about the history, is around 1500, right? It's just about the time when Europeans start colonizing the Americas and Columbus comes over there, right? And think of it. Why did he go there? Sure, gold was a big part of it. But the second G was just as important. G for gold is just one G. The second G is G for God. God was just as important. In other words, it was about converting people. It was about bringing people to
Mm.
Christianity. Who was the first person who set foot on this island, which now is basically Haiti and Dominican Republic, called then Salvador? First person was not Columbus. First person was a priest. And it was intentionally so, because it was in the name of her Catholic majesties, Isabella and Ferdinand, that he took that land. So, yes, gold was important, but God was equally important. And God can't just be boiled down to money. God has something to do with belief, with idea, with cultures. So, in other words, when you said, why did people do this? Yeah, trade routes was one. But the other thing was the spread of idea, of a particular kind of religious idea called a Christian God.
Would you say in the 15th century that's also the point where you could first like speak of a globalized world?
Well, I think you can first speak of a globalized world 10,000 years ago. Because that's
10,000.
10,000 years ago. Why do I say
Wow.
10,000 years ago, right? I say 10,000 years ago because 10,000 years ago was a monumental achievement that very few people really talk about. It's one of the biggest achievements of our species, Homo sapiens. That's when the last part of the last continent on this planet was settled by human beings. The southern tip of South America. 10,000 years ago, humans finally arrived, which meant that they were a global species. They should be called not Homo sapiens, but Homo globensis or something like that. In other words, we actually settled everywhere.
Mm.
So that means that is a huge achievement. You can't have globalization without people being on locality, right? So to be global means to be everywhere on this planet. And that was achieved 10,000 years ago. So globalization for me starts 10,000 years ago. Some people say, hey, you're too people focused. Come on. Globalization was always there. Why? Because it's a planet. Planetary, animals and plants and all of that atmosphere, that's been global from the beginning. It's just that humans are catching up with it.
That makes sense, yes.
Yeah.
But can one speak from globalization just because everywhere there are humans when they're not necessarily connected? I mean, Columbus didn't know that there were people on the Americas. He didn't even know about the Americas. Um, so can we talk about globalization? Is it actually globalization since there's no, or at least no direct connection?
Well, now you're really, really asking a very important question. And that's where we get to the real full definition of globalization. Your question is, can you have globalization just as an objective thing out there, like people all over the world? But what if they don't know each other, right? And don't know
Exactly.
that people other. In other words, globalization is also about consciousness. So
Hmm.
we have to define globalization in two ways. It's about the expansion and intensification of social relations out there in the objective world, but also in here, consciousness. So, in other words, when we talk about globalization, it's almost like consciousness is catching up with the fact that the body's already everywhere. So, globalization is as much of a subjective thing, right? As you said correctly, knowing is subjectively that there are these people out there and that there are these things out there and that I can trade. You cannot trade unless you know there's a trading partner who has something you want.
Hmm.
Trade is
What
based on that.
what then later were other catalysts, I would call them,
Right.
uh, that were greatly important for a more increased globalization?
Absolutely. And this is what globalization is about in terms of intensification, right? I always say it's a little bit like a car, like the shift cars, that you shift from first to second, and then you go a little faster, then you go to third, you go even faster, then to fourth and fifth, and then you're really rolling along, right? It's a little bit like globalization, right? It comes in sort of these shifts where you shift into higher gear. I think globalization shifted into higher gear, especially in the last 200-300 years. We sort of reached with industrial revolution, we reached sort of fifth gear, and maybe some people say with the digital revolution now we reach sixth gear, right? So we're really, 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 really moving very fast. But sometimes there are also setbacks. So it's not just a straight line. It's not just that we get faster. Sometimes we hit the brakes. So last
Mm.
time we hit the brakes on globalization, clearly was between the two world wars, right? Between 1918 and 1939. That's when the connections, in many ways, with through war, through the economic depression, the Great Depression, things were severed, things were untied. So globalization, in general, I think, has intensified. If you look over the last few hundred years, but there are also reversals possible. There are also sort of slowdowns that are possible.
Mm. And what are typically causes of slowdowns?
Causes of
You
slowdowns
mentioned.
are usually three: wars,
Mm.
economic crises, and health crises like pandemics. Think of the Black Death, right? In the Middle Ages, it's like a third of Europeans were killed in the 14th century by the bubonic plague. You know what this did for interconnectivity and connections and trade? It completely disrupted for decades what
Hmm.
was normal interconnections, even on a small level. In other words, even sort of moving from one town to another town that was 30 miles away was almost impossible because people just were scared. They wouldn't want to leave their homes. They wouldn't want to move for fear of getting infected. So connectivity was completely interrupted as a result of the pandemic, right? Which also happened with COVID in terms of
Really?
connectivity. Totally. I mean, our physical connectivity, we were just lucky that we had the internet. But without the internet, we would have been, remember social distancing? Social distancing is another word for deglobalization.
Okay. Oh, I can understand that, but still, isn't it? Didn't we have to work together globally to fight this global pandemic?
Right, but we were only able to work together because we had digital connections. Otherwise, we would have not been able to work together, certainly not in the way we were able to do that. So, for example, the fast development of the vaccine was mostly done online in terms of people talking to each other. There was very little physical contact. There were several teams around the world who worked on the vaccine, don't get me wrong. But what I'm saying is they exchanged information. And that information was crucial. And that information was conveyed through digital. So here is another lesson. During the time of COVID, did globalization slow down or did it speed up? Bad question. Meaning, globalization as information, as data, was speeding up. But globalization as bodies moving around, remember, no travel, slowed down. So it
Yes.
slowed down and it speeded up at the same time, depending on which dimensions of globalization you consider.
Okay. And the three factors you mentioned that can lead to a less globalized world, besides from actual bodies or actual humans, but besides from migration, um, did these kind of become less relevant? These three factors through digitalization?
I think that pandemic, as we saw, became less relevant. So, in other words, pandemics still horribly interrupt embodied globalization. In other words, moving bodies around or even objects moving around. But, ideas, data, and information, it doesn't bother at all. With regard
Mm.
to war, the situation is very different. So if you look at the Ukraine war, for example, between Russia and Ukraine that's going on right now, a lot of those bombs hit communication centers, hit cell towers, and disrupted digital connectivity. So war is still capable of really disrupting globalization fundamentally in all of its dimensions, right?
Mm.
Same is true with economic crises. If you really have a major economic crisis, you simply don't have the money to maybe even pay for a subscription to some sort of internet service or whatever may be necessary, or the investment may not be there for new sort of improved digital communication to be developed in the first place. So I think that economic crises and war still fundamentally disrupt. Whereas pandemics, I think, only interrupt certain dimensions of globalization.
Interesting. Interesting. So that has really changed then.
Yeah.
Um, who would you say within one state, within one country? I mean, um, does benefit more from globalization, and who benefits less?
Yeah, I could say regionally, the global north, meaning the more developed, meaning the richer countries, are definitely benefiting because richer countries tend to be also, more equipped with regard to digital globalization and so on. Whereas
And
poorer countries,
within
yeah,
and within a country?
and within countries, I think that again, those people who are on top of the food chain, so to speak, benefit more from globalization because the way globalization is being sort of operated or operationalized these days has a lot to do with capital. It has a lot to do with who has the means to be connected, right? To be connected is not a passive thing. To be connected is an active thing. So let's just take your example, right? I don't assume that you're a billionaire. I assume
Yeah.
that you really have to watch where you spend your money. Now imagine I give you for a whole year unlimited access to a private jet. Unlimited. You can go anywhere at any time, anywhere in the world you want to go. Now, would you, as a result of that, would you be flying more or less?
Probably more.
More. And as a result of that, would you be more connected or less connected?
More connected.
More connected. So that means that access to, in this case, private jet, which costs a lot of money, makes you more connected, right?
Yes.
Okay. So those people within a country who tend to have more means can be more connected than people who tend to not have more means.
Okay, but we're all in a way easier connected now through
Yeah,
the internet, right?
yeah.
So we
But
don't
it's
have to be a
only
billionaire to.
that's only one dimension. It's not satisfactory to a lot of people. I mean, yeah, you can on the internet, you can go to Tahiti if you're poor, but how about flying on your private jet to Tahiti and actually spending 2 weeks there? That's certainly more attractive than just doing sort of an internet visit.
Tourism wise, yes, but what were the factors you mentioned? I mean, there was the trade factor that is certainly possible
I
online.
think
I would say,
let's think of it as four factors, right? People,
yes,
ideas, or data,
yeah.
objects, like tradable commodities, right? And institutions. Those four: people, ideas, things, and institutions.
Um, Institutions that would be possible online. Uh,
To some
I
extent, to some
sorry
extent, to some
to some,
extent, there's
okay,
some
to some extent.
institutions where it's not possible. So think of the institution of the military.
Okay,
You can't run military bases around the world simply online. It doesn't work.
yeah, that seems hard. Um, okay, still, but as a general, being online or the internet has granted access to the value of globalization to more people, right? Or to the
Right.
poorer people as well.
Yes. But it also has made people more vulnerable to exploitation by corporations and wealthy. So, for example, people don't have to pay for a Gmail account, yet they're being data mined, whether they like it or not, right?
Mm.
So, in other words, Google is selling the information that they gather from email users to advertisers. That means even though you don't directly pay for Google email service, you pay indirectly insofar as your data, your personal data, is being sold to people who want to sell you things.
Mm. Yeah. Um, is there a case to be made that globalization in a way also helps the poorer parts of the world in general um, because problems can be attacked by the richer or by everyone together in cooperation, meaning the UN or or basically mainly the UN, of course, focuses on poorer countries to help them greater the wealth, and that is possible through globalization. The UN is a basic institution that is, I think, perfect example of globalization, right?
Yes, I think that's possible. The point, though, is how much better off are people? So if you look at the African continent, which very often is seen as an example of poor countries in general, very few exceptions. If you look at the last 25 years and you look at the GDP and you look at the numbers in terms of economic wealth, what you find is that the African continent has stagnated.
Hmm.
So, it's like a flat line on a screen. They haven't gotten much worse, but they haven't gotten better. Whereas other places in the world have gotten better. So there's an actual divergence as a result of that. So in terms of globalization, Africa is badly limping behind. There are two success stories in the last 20 years of poor countries that, through globalization, really, really improved the situation. China and India. China, as a result of attracting large transnational corporations and becoming the production center of the world because of its low wages. India, pretty much the same story. But as those countries get richer as a result of globalization, their labor uh, level is rising as well. In other words, labor costs go up there too. As people are doing better, they can afford more, right? So it's sort of a race to the bottom. The corporations that invest in China and India will find India and China soon too expensive. What are they doing? They're moving to Bangladesh. They're moving to Burma. They're moving to places where the labor costs are even lower. So that means that China and India are now in trouble. And you probably read about the fact that China's economic growth has really, really slowed down and it's not doing as well as it used to. And that's part of the fact that they are no longer benefiting as much from sort of corporations streaming into China as a manufacturing paradise because the labor costs have become too expensive. So as they're getting better, richer, wealthier, at the same time, they're also becoming in many ways less attractive for those corporations to invest in.
About Africa, I was wondering why, if they don't benefit from globalization, why don't they just um, completely shut their connections off and just focus on themselves? Really, like, um, double down on nationalism if it really doesn't help them at all.
Yeah, because globalization really helps the elites, the 1% of those countries, and they run this.
Ah.
So they're doing quite well. But if you take the aggregate, right, you measure a country not by its top 1%, you measure a country in terms of its entire wealth of its population. So 99% are stagnating, and 1% is doing much better, but the 1% is the elite that runs the country. They are very happy to be connected
Mm.
because they're benefiting from it. And as you know, most African countries are not democracies. Most African countries are either semi-authoritarian or dictatorships. So, in other words, it's those elites that control those countries. And they make sure that things stay that way because they're benefiting from it. But their populations aren't.
Mm. So at least in the economic, with the economic lens, you're agreeing to Nelson
Right.
Mandela there, right?
Right. Whereas if you take the data lens, one of the reasons why there is enhanced migration, particularly out of Africa to Europe, across the Mediterranean, is because poor people actually, even though they're poor, they can afford cell phones, and cell phones give them access to the internet, and internet gives them access to information, to migration routes, to dealers that put them on ships, sometimes under very perilous conditions, but nonetheless. So, in other words, they get the information, the data through globalization. Those poor people, those immigrants, and therefore globalization helps them. But globalization as what? As ideas, as data, as information. So they're using that dimension of globalization to better themselves. But how do they do it? They use it to actually get out of Africa, not to stay there, but to leave,
Mm.
which doesn't help Africa, right?
Yeah, no, of course not.
Right.
Oh, that's extremely interesting. I will have to watch this over and over again afterwards. Um, I have one question that in I feel like in recent months, there was more and more talks of like a conspiracy theory in a way of globalism. Like there are these global elites that want a global leadership. I've never understood why that is necessarily something bad. But do you think that that in the future or in the near future there will be a something like a global leadership?
Well, I think that global leadership is necessary. The question is, what form will it take? And the reason why I'm saying global leadership is necessary is not because I'm necessarily ideologically committed to it or politically committed to it. It's because I'm pragmatically committed to it. And here's why. I think that the biggest problems in the world today are global in nature. So let's take climate change. That's certainly a global issue. Let's take pandemics like COVID 19. That's certainly a global problem. Let's take inequality. That's not just confined to one country, but increasing inequality or stagnation is a global issue. So, all of the major problems that we're facing today, and there are many more I can add on to that list, but most of the problems are global. So, how do you tackle them? If you have national approaches, no nation, even the most powerful nation like the United States or China, are not capable of solving climate change on their own. They're not capable of solving, as we've seen, a pandemic like COVID on their own. So there has to be, let's call it global coordination, and global coordination requires global leadership. So the question is, what form will that global leadership take? Now, conspiracy theorists think that there are these elites who are unaccountable and they are behind closed doors, sort of working things out that benefits them. and they want to oppress other people and rule over other people in a secret fashion and exploit people, right? That would be a form of global leadership or global governance, which is the term that is being used, that is elitist, undemocratic, and certainly not something that I personally think I could endorse. But it could take that form. It's conceivable. However, another form of global governance would be much more democratic. Do I mean by that? You may not be old enough to remember that before the EU really sort of in the 1990s got closely connected in terms of politics and Brussels and all of that, most countries were sort of doing things on their own pretty much. There was some voluntary cooperation in Europe, but it was very much limited. So, for example, the EU was created in the 1950s as a coal and steel alliance. So it was really just confined to trading in coal and steel. That's the beginnings of the European Union. And as you know, it then got more and more intense. So what happened is that these European countries got together, formed the EU, and became more and more sort of a regional bloc, if we want to call it that, right? So in the same way, I think that countries around the world have to cooperate more and more intensely to deal with these global problems. And as a result, they will create institutions beyond the UN, institutions like the G20, like others that we can't even maybe imagine yet, that are necessary and that will draw people together under an umbrella of a global leadership. But just like you can, if you're in Germany, you can vote for European Union Parliament, right? You can send your German delegates to Brussels. So why not also vote for, let's just say, a world union? So you send your representatives of Germany to the world union government, just like you're sending them now to Brussels. You may be sending them now to, I don't know where the capital might be, maybe Buenos Aires. I'm just making that up because Argentina won the last World Cup, right? So, maybe that's going to be the capital of the world union, and you send people there. That's a democratic process, and I think there's nothing wrong with that, and I think we need that, because without that, I don't think we have the coordination to deal with these global problems.
Mm, mm. Though I'm obviously not. I don't really understand the conspiracy theory behind these behind the global elites. Um, After you just talked about that, mainly the elites benefit from globalization.
Yes.
I could see how someone could come to that conclusion, that then therefore the global elites also
Sure.
would be the one that would strive for a global leadership.
Sure, and that's what we talked about at your last broadcast on neoliberalism, right? When we said that globalization, economic globalization, in other words, the economic dimension of globalization, has taken on in the last 30, 40 years a neoliberal color, which means that it has become much more free market, much more deregulation, much more privatization, and that benefited without a doubt the economic elites, the transnational corporate CEOs, and so on and so forth. Yes, and that's why people are quite right that as long as globalization is neoliberal, there is a danger that these corporate elites are going to take over in a non-democratic and an unaccountable way. So yes, it's not something that is without any merit. I can understand that, but I think it shouldn't limit our thinking that this is the only way in which, say, a world union could work.
Mm, mm. Where do you see globalization going in the future, like trend wise? Do you think there's any way that the world could be less globalized, aside from the three factors you mentioned that can temporarily lead to less globalization?
Well, I think there's one factor in these three, and that's war, that could put an end to all of it, right? As we know, that's a nuclear conflagration. So if we have
Mm,
nuclear war on a global context, it could lead to the annihilation of humans and certainly many other species as well. And unfortunately, if you watch the Union of Concerned Scientists and their bulletins and their, remember the dooms clock, it's very
yes.
close to midnight, right? Meaning that Because I think of the global conflicts that are going on today, whether it's the Ukraine-Russia war or whether it's the Gaza war. After all, Israel does have nuclear weapons, right? What people are worried about is that we're getting closer to nuclear war than ever before, maybe since the Cold War. And that is one option that could put an end to all connectivity, to all life on Earth as we know it. So that's sort of the real deepest and darkest kind of option that's out there. But it's not something that's impossible. And think of the kinds of leaders that we see. Whether it's Putin or Xi Jinping or Donald Trump, they're not exactly democratic people. So it's something to worry about. But realistically, you're right. Realistically, I don't think that interconnectivity in some dimensions can be reversed. So I don't see any way in which digital technology is not pushing greater connectivity and that somehow we can turn the clock back on that. I don't think we can ever go back to a time before the internet or the World Wide Web. I don't think so. As a matter of fact, I think that we're probably going to get more deeply into technological options that increase connectivity, for example. So I don't think we can turn that back. Some countries may try to block it. So China is trying to has developed its own internet and its own web, has built firewalls, but these firewalls can be easily breached. And there are millions of Chinese who do it on a daily basis. So that doesn't really work very well. Walls have never worked very well. The Chinese wall has not been able to keep the barbarians out. The wall along the Rhine and the Danube in the Roman Empire was not able to keep the barbarians out. So walls don't work. We know that. So these kinds of interconnectivities, I don't think can be reversed. What are some interconnectivities that we might be able to reverse, right? Well, you could argue that perhaps what can be reversed is certain institutional globalization. So we can think of something like, again, in between the two world wars, if we become very nationalistic, if we become very, very sort of populist, nationalist, isolationist, that the sort of common institution building could really suffer as a result of that. That countries turn on themselves and they are not really reaching out institutionally to work together. But that would mean that we are in a situation where we can't really deal with global problems. So global problems are pushing us in a direction of greater connectivity. If we are to survive climate change, we need to work together. We need to be connected. We need to be globalized.
In regards to your time, I would like to go over the I think 4 factors that were trade and the
People,
up and downsides for each and one of them when we believe in greater globalization coming in the future. So what that would mean for each of the factors.
okay, so let's start with the people, right?
Yeah.
So people moving, bodies moving. We could call it embodied globalization. What are the pluses of embodied globalization? Flexibility, opportunity, people anywhere getting a job, improving themselves economically. Also, tourists seeing more of the world, being able to connect to people physically around the world. There are lots and lots of advantages in terms of greater embodied globalization. What are the drawbacks? Migration. People resent people coming in from other places, especially if they come in by the millions, right? That could really lead to nationalism. It could lead to isolationism. It could lead to hatred. It could lead to violence, right? What's another drawback? We're using a lot of carbon when we move. So whether we move by car or whether we move by plane, it's still mostly fossil fuel based. So that contributes to problems like climate change. So you can see when we take up people, that embodied globalization, in other words, that it has pluses and minuses, right? Now, if we move on to ideas, disembodied globalization, data, information, we already talked about the advantages, right? Immense flexibility, plasticity. You can be anywhere at the same time. You can change identities. If you think about, I don't know, if Meta is right and they're going to create some sort of, Google-driven, interconnectivity where you can sort of project your avatar and engage in all kinds of interactions that are right now even unthinkable. That a lot of people see that as a real advantage. It means that you're not confined to one identity. You can take on many identities and you can experience things that you haven't experienced ever. Sounds sort of enticing, right? So other great advantages are research, right? If we have greater data flows, we can exchange more research among each other, and the outcomes of research, which obviously, hopefully, is going to benefit humanity. People, as far as education, they don't have to actually pay a lot of money. If we have greater information flows, it means that the costs for education are going to go down and more people can be educated online, right? So there are lots of advantages to that. What are the disadvantages? That people are forgetting what it means to connect physically. So when you do Zoom and you get used to it, maybe you don't even feel like catching up with a person face to face anymore. There's a whole dimension that's lost. What about sex? Yeah, there's plenty of internet sex, but it's not quite as good as the real thing, right? So in other words, a lot of the activities that we take for granted in an embodied form may actually be transformed into a disembodied form and may be much less satisfying. And we may sort of lose out on that social component, right? Of sort of hanging out together and being spontaneous and being physical with each other. So that's the drawback of that second dimension, which is ideas. Now let's move on to the third one, things. Well, we can call that, say, objectified globalization. Objects moving around, whether it's tradable objects or objects like art or whatever you might think about. The advantages are obvious. The more stuff moves around, it's great for consumers if they can afford it, right? The advantages of that is that you can have greater choices of lifestyles, of choosing what you would like to surround yourself with. If it's combined with technology, think of 3D printing. Maybe you can print your own house. People are already doing that. You can design your own house. In other words, you're going to get very cheaply materials sent to you. And, again, it really increases your own individual potential in many ways. What are the drawbacks of objectified globalization? Well, there are also small objects. Like what? Greenhouse gases. They're objects. If they move around more and faster, that's not good for humans. That's called global warming. There are also even smaller objects called viruses. And actually, the German language is very good because it says das Virus. It doesn't say der or die virus, it's das Virus, meaning it's an object. It's not a living thing. It has some, life characteristics, but it doesn't really count as a fully living thing. It's an object. And the more viruses can move around, the worse it is for humans. So certain objects that have great mobility are actually very negative for connectivity, can actually destroy connectivity, ironically. So then let's move on to the final one, institutions. What are the advantage of greater institutional globalization? Well, we just talked about it, right? Leadership, coordination, tackling global problems, also relief, humanitarian relief. You talked about that a little bit when you talked about the UN can help poorer countries, right? If you institutionally extend NGOs and the UN to poor areas, then those people are being better served as a result of that institutional expansion and extension. So that's all positive. What's the negative thing? Well, again, there are certain institutions. Do you really want to expand Google further? Do you really want to expand transnational corporations further? Right? We just talked about the fact that very often transnational corporations are really sort of data mining people, and we sort of lose ownership of ourselves in many ways if our bodies become commodities, which is part of that sort of institutional economic corporate globalization. Other institutions, military. Do you really want to have military being globalized, right? Maybe not so good. Some people say, well, it's great if it's the United States. Well, it depends who's at the head of the United States. Maybe great if you have a rational leader, but if you have an irrational leader, it may not be so great. And very often, American base is also seen as imperialist, especially in the global South. People being forced. Think of Okinawa, where there's a really huge tension between American forces and the local population there, because soldiers don't act very nicely to local populations very often. So military expansion is maybe not a great thing. So once again, it depends on what institution you're talking about. But what you can see is that all four of those globalization dimension, people, ideas, objects, and institutions, they all have their pluses and minuses. And it's up to us to shape collectively sort of all of those four parts and where we're going to be going. And that's going to answer your question. Where's globalization going? It depends on who is doing the shaping, in what direction, and which of those dimensions are going to be pushed at the expense of others. Right now, we know that disembodied globalization, digital globalization, is moving ahead much faster than the others. Is that a good thing? Well, maybe, maybe not. Again, it means that we all, our physical functions become disembodied, it may not be a great thing. If you think of getting a BA online, it may be a good thing.
Manfred, thank you very much. It was really interesting to talk to you again.
Same here.
Let me ask the same old question again. Was there anything that I should have asked that I didn't, or anything else that you would like to add in the end?
Well, I think you asked great questions, and I thank you for that. And I think your listeners have a better idea. I think I just want to leave them with one thought, and that is sort of what's the bottom line? What's the takeaway of today's session? And I think there's several takeaways, of course, but the one that I would emphasize is, okay, listeners, if you hear the word globalization in public discourse, if you read about it online and papers, whatever, what you get out of this session is that you're no longer just equating it with economics, that you actually understand that globalization is much more multidimensional than just economics, and that in order to really understand what the impact of globalization is, whether it's good or whether it's bad, we need to consider it in all of its dimensions, not just in the economic dimension. That's the takeaway.
Thank you again, Manfred. If you want to know more about Manfred and his ideas on globalization, you can check out one of his 30 books that he has out on globalization, and especially the latest one. I will link it down in the comments, in the description. That is
Great.
Globalization in the 21st Century. Thank you.
Thank you, Timo. Take care.